Welcome. I'm Julie Trude, the Vice President for the League of Women Voters of Anoka, Blaine, Coon Rapids area. Tonight, we're happy to present a program on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in Minnesota. Our first speaker will be Senator Mary Kunesh, who has been very active in writing many bills that we as League of Women voter members often find ourselves advocating for. I saw she was an early sponsor of a bill for the Minnesota ERA a number of years ago, and we're still working at it and watching for progress on that this year. This is an area where she had success. I don't know how long it took, but we're going to hear now from Senator Kunesh. Welcome and thank you.
Well, happy Wash Day, everybody. Good evening. I'm State Senator Mary Kunesh. I represent District 39, which are the communities of St. Anthony Village, New Brighton, Columbia Heights and Hilltop, Spring Lake Park, and Fridley. I served 4 years in the Minnesota House, and I am now in my 4th year in the Minnesota Senate. I can't believe that time has gone so quickly. You mentioned the ERA. I did pass that off the floor of the House about 6 years ago, and did likewise off the Senate floor this past session in 2023. Unfortunately, the House did not pass it last year, and so they are bound and determined to get that passed this year, send it back to the Senate, and hopefully we can get that ballot question on the ballot this year. I'm also a descendant of the Standing Rock Nation. My grandfather was born and raised out there and came to St. Paul as a young man, and that's how our family was relocated here to the Twin Cities. Prior to working as a legislator, I was a teacher for 25 years, 20 of those as a library media specialist. When I was in the Minnesota House, I was inspired by Canada's report on their missing and murdered Indigenous women, and very moved by stories here in the United States around the missing and murdered Indigenous women and the historic trauma and death and violence and trafficking that has gone on for generation after generation, and nobody was really doing anything about it. There was very little data, and maybe Nicole will talk about that, but I was inspired to create a legislation that created a missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls task force. And in a split legislature, I was able to do that, surprisingly enough, in 2019. We immediately got to work, and that's where Nicole Martin Rogers comes into this story. She worked on that report with many of us, starting in and completed in 2020, in spite of the epidemic, or and then the pandemic. And then as a result of that, we created, I passed another piece of legislation that created a permanent office for our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, because we knew that this violence and this trauma was not unique to just women and girls, but our men, our boys, and our Two-Spirit folks too. So I was successful in creating and getting the funding for a permanent office in our state government, missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, and that's where Juliette Rudy comes into the story. And from there, we continue to build out that office and the work that is addressing this issue. This past session in 2023, I passed a piece of legislation that creates a brand new license plate, missing and murdered Indigenous relatives license plate. All of you can go out and purchase one and get it on your car to bring awareness to it. Those dollars that you pay, the majority of the dollars for that specialty plate, will go into a reward fund in the MMIR office to ensure that not only is that office funded, but it will be able to work in many different ways. And I think Juliette will talk about that. So that's what I have to share with you. In a minute or so, you're going to be hearing from two rock stars when it comes to the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives movement. And the first one I'd like to introduce is going to be Nicole Martin Rogers. She works with Advanced Consulting. She's got a 20 plus year career at Wilder Research, where she also works as a research scientist, leading program evaluations and other applied research projects. Nicole was very instrumental in keeping us organized and on track with our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives task force, and then creating a stellar exemplar report that many other states are looking at and sort of basing their work off of. And then we have with us Juliette Rudy. She is the director of the MMIR office, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. She is a tribal member of the Lower Sioux Indian community, a lifelong Minnesota resident, and she's also had a very impressive career in public safety that spanned almost 28 years. And so I will now turn it over to these two incredible women who have been doing so much of the work in partnership with me, with the legislature, with our community, and with those that are willing to listen, such as yourself. So Chimigwech Wopilatanka, I hope you enjoy this presentation.
Miigwech, Senator Kunesh. Good evening, everyone. Bonjour. My name is Nicole Martin Rogers. I'm a White Earth Nation descendant. I'm coming to you tonight from Roseville, Minnesota, which is Dakota homeland. And I'm joined by Director Rudy. Would you like to say anything, Director, before I let you get started with the presentation?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having us here. I'm excited to share what we've been doing in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office that's been in existence for 2 years. Like Senator Kunesh said, I'm a Lower Sioux tribal member. My background is in law enforcement. I spent 21 years with the St. Paul Police Department and then 7 years with the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office. I started in patrol and then worked my way through the ranks and was the chief deputy for the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office when I retired in 2017. And this position was posted in 2020, 2021, and I applied for the position because I was so excited that I could actually serve the Indigenous community here in Minnesota. My career, I served the citizens of St. Paul, the citizens of Ramsey County, and I thought after retirement, what would I do? What can I do to do more for Native people? And so I was very excited to learn of this position, and it's amazing. If you have an opportunity to read the MMIW task force report, it's amazing. And Minnesota is progressive in this area. Senator Kunesh and Nicole Martin Rogers have this report is just excellent research and a really good framework for how to proceed and how to have an impact on MMIR in Minnesota. So I think we can get started, Nicole.
Yeah, let's get started. And I just wanted to mention that you'll probably notice we're all wearing red shirts. And that's one way to recognize and show that we're remembering the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives that we're all doing this work for. So when you see us and we're wearing red shirts, or when you see a red dress, that's kind of a symbol for MMIR. So take it away, Director Rudy. Thank you.
Yep. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the background information about the MMIR and justice in Minnesota. And then Nicole will talk a little bit about key research findings and then the recommendations that came from the MMIW task force report, and then also additional research that Nicole did for the MMIR office. So I'll let her talk about that. And then next steps, what is the office doing now? And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So the MMIR epidemic, although Indigenous women make up less than 1% of the population in Minnesota, they account for 8% of the homicide rate. And this is research that Wilder, the organization Nicole works for, came to light. And then from 27 to 54 American Indian women and girls in Minnesota were missing in any given month from 2012 to 2020. So I collect the most basic form of data right now from the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And currently, at the end of January of this year, 2024, we have 69 missing Indigenous people in Minnesota, or 64. And the oldest case is from 1977. And so it's, when I see these statistics, I just I get like angry and upset, because it's like we need to do more. We need to do more to find our relatives and for their families. So Nicole did the research with the MMIW task force, and they identified the root causes of why is this happening to our Indigenous people in Minnesota? What is going on? And the research showed that it is historical trauma, racism, sexism, colonialization, and the sexual objectification of women and girls. And people get a little they feel uncomfortable talking about these root causes, but it's a reality of the situation. I mean, Indigenous people had experienced this, and they suffered. They're suffering today from the systemic risk factors that were identified through the research too. Substance use disorder, poverty, sexual violence, our criminal justice system, and human trafficking, child welfare, the child welfare system, housing insecurity, intimate partner violence. And so those are the systemic risk factors. All right, Nicole, I can't see my notes, but I'm going to pull my PowerPoint up. So we're going to talk a little bit about the 11 tribal nations that share geography with Minnesota. We have 11 tribal nations. There's jurisdictional issues that come up when we talk about MMIR in Minnesota. We have what is called Public Law 280 for tribes. That's state jurisdiction. And then tribes exempt from Public Law 280, Red Lake and Boys Fort are federal jurisdiction. So all kinds of jurisdiction issues arise when it comes to MMIR in Minnesota. And you know what, honestly, I heard a presentation by a judge that talked a little bit about jurisdiction, and we could do a lot of research, a lot more research on how we can make a difference with the jurisdictional issues with MMIR in Minnesota. So currently the office that I work in, we work under the Department of Public Safety, Office of Justice Programs. And the Office of Justice Programs primarily provides victim services and resources to all Minnesotans. The MMIR office is housed in the Office of Justice Programs. And a little bit about our office is like Senator Kunesh said, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force was created by the Minnesota legislature in 2018 to, like I said, to talk or to look at what is causing this. Why is this happening? The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Advisory Council was created by the Minnesota legislature in 2022. We currently have 20 20 advisory council members that come from all over the state of Minnesota, the 11 tribal nations, and then also victim service advocates. We have a retired medical examiner that sits on our advisory council. We have some law enforcement that sit on the advisory council as well. So the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office was created in 2022. And then also, currently there is a Missing and Murdered African and American Women Girls Task Force. And there was a bill passed to create an office, and they're currently hiring a director for that office as well. And that there was some research done so that this office could be created because there was a disproportionate amount of African-American women and girls that were missing and that are missing and or were murdered. Also, the U.S. government and several other states in Canada have also started or completed similar efforts to address MMIR, the MMIR and injustice. And interesting in visiting with some of my counterparts in different states, they are behind Minnesota. I mean, they haven't done the research that Minnesota has to address MMIR. So here is a list of the MMIW task force members. And like I said, that the report and the work that went into the report was amazing. And so I always, am thankful for this group. I mean, back at the time, it was Representative Mary Kunesh who was leading the charge. And there was also representatives from the BCA, the Sheriff's Association, U.S. Attorney's Office, the Second Judicial Court, and all the 11 tribal nations had a representative on the task force, and then also some victim service providers in the state. So our office is located at 445 Minnesota, and I started off as an office of one. I was given funding to hire 3 staff. We have a community planner, a violence prevention coordinator, and an intelligence specialist. And I was currently given allocated funding to hire 2 additional staff, a victim specialist, and then a case review coordinator. And we currently provide support services to families. We do a lot of educational and awareness presentations. We attend a lot of community events. We're trying to work on streamlining data, collecting data, and to come up with a holistic approach on how we report data on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in Minnesota. And then we also provide technical assistance to law enforcement when there's a case our families are involved in. We kind of are a liaison between the family and law enforcement. Our work is informed by extensive research. And the MMIW Task Force report was presented to the Minnesota legislature in December of 2020. And then our office was created. There were 20 mandates that came out of that report. Then we also worked with Wilder and Nicole Martin Rogers on this another research project where they looked into the investigation, victim services, media, and prevention, and that was completed in October of 2023. And then Nicole will discuss that more with her portion. So our goals for MMIR justice in Minnesota is to address systemic causes behind the disproportionate violence experienced by Indigenous people in Minnesota, collect and report on data on violence against Indigenous relatives and people in Minnesota, address policies and practices in institutions that impact violence against Indigenous people in Minnesota, reduce and eliminate violence against Indigenous people in Minnesota, and then help Indigenous families, survivors, and their communities to prevent and heal from violence.
Thanks, Director Rudy. I'll start in here again. My name is Nicole Martin Rogers, and I'm happy to be here talking with you tonight about this topic. So as Director Rudy said, in 2023, the MMIR office contracted with Wilder Research, where I work, and we were asked to conduct this study about these topics I'll tell you more about. But first, I'd like to thank my colleagues from Wilder Research and our consultants, including Chris Bockers, who's a former FBI agent, and he currently works at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's an expert in missing persons investigation, and he actually helped solve the Jacob Wetterling case. And he provided a lot of expert guidance to us about the technical pieces of missing person investigations. We also subcontracted with Nicole Matthews from the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, and also Roger Smith from the Fond du Lac Tribal Council and the FDL Police Department. I'd also like to thank Director Rudy and the MMIR office staff who work with us closely on this project, and of course want to thank and acknowledge the survivors and relatives and experts who participated in this study and who informed this research. So the initial goal of the study and what Director Rudy had asked us to do was to develop a protocol for missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. But we soon realized that this was too big of an issue and with too many different stakeholders involved to cover it all with a single protocol. So instead, we ended up focusing on these 9 topic areas. I don't have enough time to tell you all about the details within each of the topic areas. I'll try to tell you a little bit about each one, but if you're interested, I did put in the chat links to the full report, both this one that we finished in 2023 and the original MMIR task force report. So those can be found on Wilder Research's website and the MMIR office website as well. So the key themes that we identified in these areas are based on best practices and promising practices that we identified through a review of published literature. And we also did interviews with experts in each of these areas. We also completed extensive federal and state level policy reviews, and we conducted 3 listening sessions around the state with survivors and victims' relatives. So through this research, we were able to identify gaps in policy and practice that can be addressed through the recommendations in the report. And again, I'm going to share some of the key gaps we identified, and I'll highlight some of the most important recommendations. So first, in terms of reporting an initial investigation of missing persons, there are a lot of federal and state laws about missing children, but for adults, there are actually no federal laws requiring reporting or investigation, and laws vary state to state. So it's important to note that it's not actually illegal to be missing if you're an adult. You can choose to leave without telling your family or your employer and just decide to disappear. In Minnesota, we do have the Missing Persons Act, which states that law enforcement may not refuse a missing persons report unless they know the location and can confirm the welfare of the person who's reported missing. So someone might have decided to leave, but as long as they're okay and no one is holding them against their will, that's all law enforcement needs to do. However, we know that this law might run contrary to what many people believe. A lot of people have seen on TV, you know, there's a 48-hour waiting period before you can report someone missing or some misconceptions like that. And we also found in our research that law enforcement may sometimes have biases. So if the person who's being reported as missing is already known to them, they might be known as a drug addict or someone who's involved in prostitution, someone who has mental illness, or someone who's otherwise transient or homeless. So then law enforcement might ask the person who's reporting, let's just wait and see. Maybe they'll show up, they'll come back, you know, they always come back. And then they don't get the data into a data system that would allow other law enforcement to see that person is missing. They might not issue an alert and other things that can really help to expedite closing a case like that. So our research found that there is a lot of guidance about effective policies and procedures for missing persons, cold cases, and death investigations. These policies, however, need to be implemented and followed consistently. In Minnesota, this might include local law enforcement agencies updating their policies, and also the POST board, which is the Peace Officer Standards and Training Board for the state, which oversees law enforcement credentialing and training. They need to update their policy templates and guidance to be sure it adheres to current best practices and developments in technology and other things. Another recommendation we made was to update the post board exam so that when someone is taking the test to become a law enforcement officer, there would be a question about Minnesota's missing persons law to make sure that then the law enforcement officer training programs would make sure to cover best practices and the law in Minnesota in their curriculum. And we also recommended that they would cover issues specific to the MMIR and justice in law enforcement training programs. A particular area of concern we uncovered in our research is the number of American Indian youth who are in out-of-home placements. And we know that American Indian children are vastly overrepresented in the child protection system. And we also know that children who are in out-of-home placement are vulnerable to exploitation. So one gap that we identified in our research was that American Indian children who repeatedly run away from their out-of-home placements, in some case it's known or suspected that the child is being trafficked or exploited. You know, sometimes the various parts of the system, including the child protection from the county, child protection from the child's tribe, the school system, local law enforcement, they might not be working together as well as they could to prevent or intervene for these children. The kids might be labeled as runaways. They might be viewed as bad kids, when in reality, these kids need intensive help and intervention to escape a situation that's very, very high risk for them. So in terms of communication and alert system, Minnesota has several alert systems, including Amber Alerts, Blue Alerts, and missing person alerts that go through the Minnesota Crime Alert Network. Blue Alerts are very specific for when a law enforcement officer is killed or seriously injured. Amber Alerts are for very specific types of missing children cases where there's adequate information, such as a vehicle description, that is available, which would warrant sending out this information to the general public. And many of you may see the alerts on billboards or on your cell phone when there's an Amber Alert issued. However, most missing person cases, many missing children cases, and all missing adult cases don't qualify for either of these, but they might fit under a missing person alert through the Minnesota Crime Alert Network. And this is an alert that goes out to law enforcement and other entities that have specifically signed up to receive the alert. The problem is that the system might be a little bit clunky and the missing person alerts are mixed in with all other types of crime alerts, so it might not always draw the attention of people who need to see it. So we recommended further investigation about potential improvements to the missing person alert system and more collaboration with the MMIR office when there's an MMIR case to make sure that these cases get increased attention and awareness in Indian country and on social media that's common for American Indian audiences. In terms of review and investigation of unresolved or cold cases, we wanted to be sure that evidence is collected and stored properly at the time of a crime or death, so that even if the crime can't be solved immediately, the evidence will be available for future investigators to use. So technology improves every day as far as DNA evidence, as far as cell phone tracking and, cell phone location technology and stuff. So a sample or a piece of evidence that's not usable today might be usable 1 year from now if it's stored and documented properly. So that's really, really important in these cases. And especially when you think about a small law enforcement agency that maybe only has one missing person every 10 years or something, like how do they know and remember those best practices for the scene of the crime right when they get there, so that all these things are preserved properly. We also want to be sure that MMIR cases get reviewed regularly and that they have a fresh set of eyes available, best expertise available in the state. So this often involves collaboration across agencies because, again, many small law enforcement agencies don't have the capacity or the expertise to conduct a thorough or rigorous investigation, especially of their cold cases, since they also have pressing new business to attend to and they might only have a couple of officers. So balancing those things can be really challenging. And one recommendation is that a cold case review board with experts from across the state could be useful in this regard to bring MMIR cases and other unsolved cases in front of this board. So in terms of death investigation, this is something that was really interesting to me because I did not know this in the past, but in Minnesota, some counties use a coroner and some counties use a medical examiner. And so in counties with a coroner, that person is not necessarily trained in forensic death investigation. That person is a doctor that's appointed by the county board. And that person decides if an autopsy is conducted or a thorough death investigation is needed for particular cases of death. And sometimes they contract with a medical examiner to do that, but they might have a limited budget. They might only have $1,000 and they can only do one, autopsy per year or something. They might also, bias might also come into play in these situations. For example, if someone who's a known drug user dies, it might be easier and less costly to rule that person's cause of death as an overdose, even if relatives feel that there are suspicious circumstances that should be further investigated. And we actually heard about several MMIR cases like this that happened in Minnesota. We recommended reducing the barriers for tribes and counties that use a coroner to complete more thorough and rigorous death investigations with a qualified medical examiner. We also found in our research that families often don't understand or might not agree with the findings from the investigation of their loved one's death, and they often don't receive an adequate or clear layperson's explanation of the final findings. So this causes a lot of tension, is that people feel like their relative wasn't done justice because of the death investigation that they don't believe was true or was done in a good way. And there are also cultural factors such as beliefs around death. There's ceremonies, there's restrictions on use of deceased individuals' names or images, and there's related topics, and these vary from tribe to tribe. So they're not the same for all 500 tribes across the US. Each tribe has their own customs and beliefs. And a lot of times medical examiners and coroners and law enforcement, others who are involved with the death investigation, might not be aware of these, and that can also lead to problems and additional trauma for the families when these death investigations are happening. So we recommended that more training might be needed for these professionals. And then Director Rudy talked a little bit about this already, but in terms of jurisdiction issues and government to government collaboration, she showed you just a small taste of the complex web of federal and state laws that determine jurisdiction for various crimes in Indian country. There's Public Law 280, there's the Indian Civil Rights Act, there's the Tribal Law and Order Act, Violence Against Women Act. The state of Minnesota also has, as Director Rudy mentioned, concurrent jurisdiction to prosecute crimes in Indian country on most reservation, but there's a complicated set of laws and agreements that govern these cross-jurisdiction arrangements, and it does vary across tribes. And Minnesota is pretty advanced as far as other states with our infrastructure and policies related to government collaboration. So in Minnesota, tribes in the state use MOUs or cross-deputization and other forms of agreements to clarify and address their jurisdictional issues. One tool that was developed specifically to address MMIR related cases is called a Tribal Community Response Plan. And the process to develop this plan is led by the tribe, but it's collaborative process with local law enforcement and other agencies so that the logistics can be worked out ahead of time. So these agencies don't need to try to figure out who has jurisdiction for what parts of a case. If a missing person case or a violent crime or other tragedy does occur, it's much easier to negotiate these types of things ahead of time and have a plan in place rather than trying to figure it out in the midst of a crisis and based on the whims of whoever happens to be in charge at that time. So in the report, we recommended that if tribes in Minnesota, because they are sovereign nations, so it's their choice of whether they wanted to pursue a tribal community response plan, but if they did, that we recommended they should receive the support and collaboration from the MMIR office and other state agencies to develop these TCRPs. And I know I've been talking at you for a few minutes here. I just have a couple things I wanted to say on these slides. Again, I don't have time to go over all the details, but please check out the reports if you're interested. Just a couple quick things about these topics. I wanted to say something regarding prevention. So we need to raise the general level of awareness in the population about the MMIR injustice and the systemic causes of this issue, including poverty, homelessness. When you go to Minneapolis, who do you see who's homeless? It's all Native people. They're very much overrepresented among the homeless population in the state. They're also overrepresented in child protection, in the criminal justice system. We also need to teach about trafficking, exploitation, and healthy, intimate relationships in schools. Since so many of our children are exposed to unhealthy examples, maybe at home or in their community, for sure on social media, we need to counter the normalized violence that many young kids, and especially Native girls, have been taught by society. Just think about Pocahontas and the lies that we are told about that story from Disney and from our high school social studies classes. We also need to pay attention to the people who are most vulnerable to going missing or experiencing violence, including people who are in relationships that involve domestic violence, people who are being trafficked, people who are homeless, people who are coming out of prison. Traffickers wait for women coming out of prison at Shakopee to pick them up because they don't have another ride. So more resources are needed to prevent and intervene early for people who are experiencing these situations, which make them extremely vulnerable to becoming MMIR statistics. And last thing I'll say is just regarding the media. It seems that some progress has been made in recent years, but there's a historic pattern of the media not covering MMIR cases or portraying the victim in an unfavorable light. And this has led to mistrust in the community and could be one reason why family members might not always report when their loved one goes missing right away. They just don't believe that law enforcement or the media is going to do anything about it because they've heard the stories from others in the community where that's what happened. So journalists and law enforcement and all these other professionals we're talking about need to be educated on the context of MMIR injustice. And in this case, how it's portrayed in the media, how that impacts the victim's case, and how it impacts the families and community's well-being. So now I'm going to turn this back to Director Rudy to talk a little bit more about what's next for the MMIR office and how you can help.
All right, thanks, Nicole. Our next steps for the MMIR office is we're going to develop a data dashboard, and the data dashboard will be a holistic look at MMIR data that pertains to the risk factors, so that we can get a big picture of what, these different areas and how it's having an impact on MMIR in Minnesota. We're also going to make some recommendations to the Minnesota Post Board, which is the Police Officers Standard and Training Board, and talk about how we can ask for them to change some learning objectives, questions on the exam, and then come up with a model missing person policy. And it's training for law enforcement pre-service. So when they're in a 2-year or 4-year program to become law enforcement officers, and then also after they become police officers, so in-service training, make some recommendations for that. And then to develop a protocol on emergent missing persons, long-term missing persons, and death investigations. We want to do some more on case reviews. We have families that come to us that want us to take a look at their cases when they're missing persons cases, and their cases when a loved one has been murdered or committed suicide, or there was an overdose. We need to work on clarifying what the MMIR office will do and will not do. And then we're really working hard this year to collaborate across state agencies, and then also other victim service providers from the different 11 tribal nations, and then other victim service providers within the urban community as well. We want to provide support to community-based organizations on best practices, gather feedback from the tribal nations. What are they looking for? What would they like us to assist with? And there's some work to be done on data sharing needs and tribal community response plans, and what all that entails. And we're going to have, that we might need memorandums of understanding to work with the tribal nations on getting data from them. And then providing access to crime victim reimbursement funds, getting information out on that. And then gathering feedback from people who are directly impacted by MMIR. We are stronger in community, and when I look at this, it's a really community restorative justice process. We all can do better, and what we're doing right now is not enough. We have to do more. Our office wants to listen, learn, and collaborate with other organizations. We want to partner with people and communities impacted by MMIR, and as well as with those who have been doing the work before us. There's a lot of really good work happening in Minnesota. I meet with people with different programs, and I'm like so impressed with some of the programming in Minnesota. And most of all, we want to make a difference to reduce and end violence and MMIR injustice in Minnesota. And I believe we can do that through our culture, through our spirituality, and through education. How can the community help? We can help, we can all help respond and change system response to eliminate MMIR injustice in our communities. And here are some of the things that you can do. Timely reporting and community engagement. When a loved one goes missing, it's critical. Call 911. There's no waiting period. And that comes from Brandon's law in Minnesota. There's no 24-hour or 48-hour waiting period. So call 911 and report a loved one missing. Donate to nonprofits in your community that serve survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Volunteer with local initiatives and nonprofits to serve survivors of domestic violence and sexual abuse. Volunteer or donate to homeless shelters. Share flyers and posters of individuals missing in your area. Educate yourself about human trafficking in your community. Offer your skills to have conversations and bring awareness with others, faith groups, PTA, civic groups. Challenge false attitudes and beliefs. Believe victims. Listen to what they tell you with openness. Know the resources in your area and do something if you see something suspicious. Share social media posts about MMIR and consider how your organization can collaborate with MMIR. Well, that's the end of our presentation. So we're available to answer any of your questions.
I've asked people to put any questions they might have in the chat, but when I was looking at the calendar, you have a day of remembrance coming up. Do you want to does somebody want to talk about that and fill us in?
So on February 14th is a day of remembrance in Minnesota, and we're having a march and a gathering in Minneapolis. I could share the poster in the chat. It would take me a few minutes to find it. I'm not the most technologically savvy person there is. So I'd have to look for it and then I can put it in the chat. It starts at 11 o'clock. We'll have speakers. And it's a march and a rally, and it's in Minneapolis. And I will look up the poster and put it in the chat. We will also be sharing with the public that we have a MMIR license plate that's going to be released and available. And on February 15th, you can purchase them. Here's a sample of what the plate will look like. And we'll be talking about that on February 14th. $25 from each plate will go into, it's called the Gagi Gay Mikwenda Goziwug Reward Fund account. And that reward fund is available for MMIR to offer in the future. It's still being set up. The board is being set up, and in the future to offer tips, reward money for tips, and then also to help families with billboards and any other expenses that MMIR may need.
And it seems that Director Rudy, that you spent a lot of time in law enforcement, and a lot of the issues and policies that are being developed involve training. And so perhaps our role as women with League of Women Voters is more the area of just being the awareness, good listeners. As you talked about, we are actively supporting shelters that support women who are abused, children and women who are abused. The public education piece seems to be a really big part of this too. And maybe you or the senator or Nicole can come up with some other things you can tell us that would help us get the word out, because I don't know. I think we're people who read a lot, we talk a lot, we're curious, but some people just aren't even aware this is a problem. And obviously from the numbers, we have a big problem. So so raising public awareness, and certainly I love that family members who have a broken heart over what's happened with their daughter or spouse or relative have some place to go where there's somebody who's caring and can be resourceful and help guide their local law enforcement or help guide law enforcement. But there's so much to this. Well,
Well, there is so much to this, and I think what you all can do is share this information that you've learned here today. You're recording it, so share the recording so that people become better educated around it, around this situation. There is so much information now. When I first started back in, 2017, 18, just trying to get some data because everybody wanted data. Like, how is this? Where is this happening? How many is it happening to? Wait, why is it happening? And there was no data that was being collected. Now there is. And if you Google MMIR or MMIW, Minnesota, or just in general, there's much, much more information out there that can be shared. The office is got a dashboard that you can, or a website that you can look at. Now that you kind of have an awareness, you're going to start to see things all over the place and hear things all over the place about this issue. There are studies being done now, reports being created, and it's hard if you're not in Indian country, because you might not come across information or be talking to somebody about it. But the best thing that you can do is just talk about it, look for more information around the subject, And then in May, before the end of the session is over, I think it's around May 4th, we always have an official MMIR day at the Capitol. And it's an awesome, awesome day. And every year it's a little bit different.
Well, those national recognitions and the press is really, I think, a big part of this. So I looked at that report. Oh my gosh, 150 pages. Nicole, you have quite a team of people working with you in at the Wilder Research Center, and you talked about the support you had from the individuals who spoke with you, the law enforcement, the FBI that supported you. So I'm very glad to hear there's a lot of professional support for your research and development of policies going forward, because it probably will improve things in the future, that we have better policies at every local law enforcement, and that we're working through these jurisdictional issues. I'm a lawyer, I understand. And then the sovereign nations complicate things, and some people can use that as an excuse. So you're trying to help build bridges to help align the interests of local law enforcement with the Native American community, so that we aren't seeing this as a wall. Instead, we're working as human beings who care about one another. So I think the collaborative efforts that we're hearing about Minnesota make us feel really good about our state having care and concern. So that is really good news. We had a couple of things pop up in the chat where people have brought up topics. Are there things there that any of you feel like you want to bring up publicly on the meeting? We have, people mentioning resources and statistics, books. We have a well-read group. We had a speaker talk about the boarding school at the University of Morris about 2 years ago, and our interest is just growing in trying to understand the challenges of Native families in our state. There's a couple of comments about victim blaming. Jody's bringing up, as a culture, we tend to blame the victim. And she points out it's an attitude issue. And what can we do about this attitude? And I don't know. It's kind of a social issue.
Yeah, I would just add there that I think women in general have been blamed for things like domestic violence and sexual assault and other things. But when you're a Native American woman, and when you're involved in prostitution, or when you're a drug user, or other factors where that stigma just layers on top, when you're experiencing homelessness, it both puts you at extreme risk of becoming MMIR, and it also makes you much more likely to not be helped by the system in the way that a white woman from a middle-class background would be helped if she went missing off the street in Minneapolis and her family called to report her missing. So there's those kind of multiple layers of stigma that come in with victim blaming and judging a lot of times. And not to say that all Native women who go missing, or Native relatives who go missing, are drug addicted or homeless or whatever, but there's a lot of risk factors involved with that. And we've heard from families that who did have a loved one go missing, that they felt maybe law enforcement wasn't taking it as seriously because their child had already been labeled as a runaway, or because their relative who went missing was a known drug user by law enforcement. So it can be an issue.
Yeah, it's a very complex, difficult topic. I appreciate when I looked at your study that you had come up with some new processes and procedures to help guide law enforcement, so they recognize maybe some inborn negativity they bring to looking for lost teens that come from broken families or difficult situations, that they really need to just look at each person as an individual. And if they just go through, here's the steps you need to take, instead of putting a label on somebody and not taking steps. So, going through those processes and making sure each person's treated individually and fairly, hopefully, having those adopted throughout the state and throughout law enforcement agencies will help reduce some of the biases that are built into our system.
Yeah,
And having come from law enforcement, I think Director Rudy probably saw a lot of that over her lifetime.
Well, that's why she wants a protocol, right? Is because cops tend to be rule followers, not all of them, but if you tell them what the rules are and what they're supposed to do, they like to follow the steps, right? And they like to do it correctly. But if there's not adequate guidance and they have never done a missing person investigation before, or they haven't done one for 10 years and no one in their agency has, it can be really hard to remember and follow all those steps and follow what the law is if it's just not right in front of you, the guidance of what to do next.
I've been reading Casey Keeler's book on Native American moving into the suburbs, kind of the impediments to purchasing homes and that kind of thing. But in the conclusion to that book, she looks at the Native American houselessness in Minneapolis. And I was wondering about culturally appropriate housing. Is that something that I think that would probably help in all these issues if people had a place to live that felt comfortable and more appropriate for them, or am I misled here?
Speaking frankly, from my perspective, I think there's a need for culturally appropriate housing. And I think there's also probably an even bigger need to figure out solutions of how to effectively and safely house someone who has opiate addiction, because many of the people that are experiencing, the homelessness in the encampments are also struggling with opiate addiction. And that's a very, very difficult combination to address. There's some folks that say harm reduction and that we have to get people into housing first before they can ever get sober. And then there's other people who want to have rules for safety in their housing about not using opiates in the housing because other people are trying to get sober and stuff. So it's just a very difficult situation. I think that has layers of and then all the trauma that Native people have in their families and in their blood and in their genetics from everything that's happened to us, the addiction and mental illness and all that kind of, it's just, it's a very difficult situation. So culturally responsive maybe, but also a lot of other complex problems there too.
Mental health issues are also, go kind of hand in hand with the opioids or addiction issues. And the solution to this homelessness and to this chronic, sort of vagrancy or transiency, it is very complicated, but it really needs to be almost all the work that we do within our community has to be community led. It has to be culturally appropriate, and it has to be accessible, from day to day, given, how inconsistent days can be. And so we are looking for it. I know that Hennepin County says anybody that needs a place to stay, we've got a place to stay. But you have to remember that these are communities, and there are a lot of, they might be relationships that we have never had in our lifetime, but there are strong relationships between these people in these communities. And to say, well, we've got places for you to stay, but you have to go here and you go there and you go there, that safety and that security of knowing each other, we have to find a way to, if we're going to move that community out of a park, where can we take them where they can all be together and continue that support system that we might see as perhaps unhealthy, but for them is all that they have. And so when you disperse everybody, it's just like another relocation era for all of those people when they moved, our ancestors from one place to the next. And so there has to be some real sensitivity. And unfortunately, there's just not one answer for everything.
I think we could have another evening on that whole topic. And I see our time is up. We appreciate all the time and energy and work that's gone into the research and trying to bring it down to a level for the average citizen like us to understand a little bit more about the work that you're doing. And I just want to, on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Anoka, Blaine, Coon Rapids area, want to thank you all for your contributions to improving the well-being of families in Minnesota, because I just can't imagine what these families have suffered, and knowing that they've been heard and that there are people who care and things are going to get better and improve has to be encouraging, and a wonderful message that you are offering to Native American communities and to families as a whole, because we have so many families that there's multicultural marriages. A lot of us have children in multicultural marriages. Some of you are. So all of our hearts grieve for those who are lost. And we hope that the work that you're doing improves finding missing women and children in our state. So thank you this evening for your time. Thank you, Senator, for your hard work. We applaud you, and we are standing behind you. And when you need someone at a committee hearing or to support some of your work, contact us.
Okay,
We have some very seasoned people who have done this work and they care. So
thank you.
thank you all.